Well, good evening and welcome, family, to the Kairos moment. This is Pastor Milton, and thank you so much for joining me tonight. So excited again for all that God is doing and all He's going to continue to do. We have a lot in store. I want you to be able to pull up and find a comfortable chair. I want you to get your notepads together. A lot of information that's going to be dropped today that I believe is going to really be impactful and really help us. Just as a way of just some housekeeping real quick, and then I'll be stepping out of the way and introduce our special guest speaker. Just want to let you know that once again that for the month of August, we will also be having two dynamic speakers that will be coming forth. That's the first person is going to be Pastor Susan Graham. I can't talk enough about my dear sister. She's going to be bringing the word on the Kairos moment. And ending the month of August, none other than Elder Anthony Graham will also be helping us along with insights from the Word of God. Very excited about it. So for tonight, my special guest is literally my brother, my big little brother, taller than me. And it just seems that in the hereditary area, everybody else got height except for me. But I'm still in therapy right now, but it's all right. But I'm going to be introducing my brother, Michael Gordon James, shortly. And just he's going to be helping us unpack and understanding, for example, surviving encounters and what that entails when we're involved with the police or law enforcement. And so at the ending of Mike's presentation, what I would really like you to do, if you can, please, just drop in the chats any questions that you have. He's not going to be giving legal counsel, but he may be able to direct us to some principles. And so I just want you to be cognizant of that. I believe in my heart, what you need to do tonight is to reach out to all of your friends regarding this broadcast tonight. I'm hoping that you will let your friends, family, just DM them, blast an email, send a text that they need to tune in, because the information that's going to be dropped tonight is life-saving. I'm not being exaggerating about this. I'm not being dramatic. I really believe that the Lord impressed in my heart that this is very important for us to be able to have this type of knowledge, this type of information. And it's not just an information that we just take for today, but we hide in our hearts. We teach our kids, our students, our relatives, young and old, does not matter, because there's a scripture that says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." And that's what we want to avoid. And so without further ado, I just want to introduce to you my brother, Michael Gordon James. Welcome, Mike, to the program. How are you today?
I'm very well, Milt. Pastor James.
No, I'm still your brother, still your big little brother. So,
That's right.
Michael, at this point, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. I want to get out of the way. I just want you to just flow and just go forth. And so I just handed the baton over to you.
Sure. All right. Thank you, and thank you for everyone for being here, and thank you, Pastor James, for this opportunity to speak a little bit. This is the sort of thing that I have been thinking about doing for actually a number of years, and I spoke to my lovely wife Claudia about it a couple of times about speaking at churches or something like that, and it just never materialized. But this, I guess, is a godsend. So we're able to do something like this. And the reason why I wanted to do something like this is not just because Pastor James is my brother, my literal brother, of course, um, but I think it's something that's very important, uh, and not just in light of what's happening today, because uh, the issue of police citizen encounters, it's gotten a lot of press in recent years, but this has been going on for as long as there have been police and citizens, to be frank. And I'm going to focus tonight mainly about New York. That's where I was a prosecutor for a number of years. And I'll talk a little bit about New York's procedure, but these are similar procedures to every state. So if you're viewing this broadcast or listening to this broadcast and you live outside of New York, no matter where you live, many of these procedures are the same type of procedures. And so we'll just begin. This will be in three parts. And again, my name is Michael G. James, Michael Gordon James. You can see that on the screen there. I've been a prosecutor in the Bronx County, New York. I was there for about 6 years. I've done a number of trials, number of suppression issues. And when I say suppression, I mean when the police arrest someone and they have some sort of contraband, whether it's drugs or firearms. Their lawyers will oftentimes file motions to suppress. So you may hear me make reference to the word suppress. So that's what I'm talking about. That's the context of the word. First, though, there's a lawyer caveat, of course. I'm doing this for educational purposes, and of course, this doesn't make a attorney-client relationship between myself and anyone who's listening to this broadcast and who may later on ask a question about a particular case. If you have particular legal issues, you must consult with an attorney in your jurisdiction before you proceed. Okay, so anything I say to you today, I don't mind if you quote me, but it's not legal advice, and your particular situation or circumstance should be dealt with through an attorney of your choice. Okay. All right. So again, the topic for tonight is police-citizen encounters, or what to do when you're stopped by the police, and what your rights are. So that's what the basics are tonight. I'm not going to go point by point into every aspect of law in this, but just what I think is pertinent to the issue that we're talking about. Now, the presentation will be in three parts. The first part is a quick introduction to what I call stops, and by stop I mean when you're on your way, whether you're in a vehicle or you're walking, and you encounter a police officer, and you're literally stopped. You're literally stopped by the police, whether you're walking or you're driving, or you may have been, if you're in a car, you may be parked someplace, and an officer approaches you and starts speaking to you. That's what I mean by stop right now. All right. And we're going to talk about the factors that occur during these sort of encounters, and how some of these factors can raise the encounter to a point where now the officer is investigating you, or maybe even just doing an arrest. And so we're going to talk a little bit about all of those things right now. Okay. The second part will deal with what to do when you are stopped by the police. And the third will talk about the actual arrest process. And that's what I was talking about, the arrest process in New York, which is very similar to whatever state or county that you live in right now, but it'll be primarily New York City. And much of the information that I'm drawing from, as I say, is my own experience as a former assistant district attorney in the Bronx, and also some information from the Legal Aid Society. In New York City, the Legal Aid Society is what you would call a public defender's office, and they're pretty good. And I used to tangle with them a lot. And in New York, if you go online, you could see much of their information, and it is quite helpful to someone who is either charged with a crime, or their loved one is charged with a crime, and they're trying to get some basic information. I've seen, and I'm diverting a little bit from my script I have here, but when you talk about lawyers, sometimes I've heard people say things such as Legal Aid Society lawyers or public defenders aren't real lawyers. I once heard a person state in court that they didn't want their legal aid lawyer because they wanted a real lawyer, quote unquote, a real lawyer. I can tell you from the perspective of someone who used to prosecute cases, the plea offers didn't change whether you got a private lawyer or a Legal Aid Society lawyer. Don't be fooled by that. If you are in a legal situation, I've seen some private lawyers at arraignments. An arraignment is when, in New York, when someone is being charged, and this goes into the arrest process, and we'll give you a little bit of preview. And the family is usually very desperate. They want a lawyer, and you'll see private lawyers sometimes talk to the family members and discourage them from using legal aid. And I've seen in the past, I've seen family members giving lawyers gold jewelry and things to barter with to begin the representation process at arraignment. So I can tell you that if you get a good experienced legal aid society lawyer, then you're just as good or better off than many private lawyers. All right, well, that being said, let me go back to this. All right, now the scenario we're going to talk about is what I call a typical street encounter. And that includes car stops. And by that I mean, as I stated, you're walking down the street and an officer approaches you and literally stops you from walking because they're questioning you. Or if you're driving, they pull you over. Or if you're in a car parked, let's say illegally, for instance, the officer walks up to you and starts talking to you. These are the kind of encounters we're talking about. What we will not be talking about are certain type of encounters, such as border stops. And by border stops, I mean, if a person's in a car and they're trying to cross a border, like the Mexican border or the Canadian border, or certain stops at airports, because they're oftentimes considered borders and there are particular rules to those and not really relevant to what we're talking about. Now, stops can also come about because of information other than just randomized or the officer sees a crime in progress. Sometimes it could be a tip, and and then how that becomes relevant is later on whether that tip was based on a reliable source or just an anonymous person, or search warrants or arrest warrants. When you hear the term warrant, it means that an officer went before a judge and they showed the judge there was probable cause either to search let's say it's your vehicle we're talking about. That means they would have shown to the judge claiming probable cause that there was evidence that the car contained some sort of contraband at the time that the search warrant was issued. If there's an arrest warrant, that means they've been able to show a judge that you, the individual, committed a crime and they're taking you into arrest. And so those are types of encounters as well. And we're not dealing primarily with those tonight. We're dealing more with what I call the typical street encounter. All right. Okay, so let's talk about part one now. And in part one, we're talking about stops. And when I say stops, there's a source of law that gives us protections. And I say us, I mean all citizens. And those are the Constitution. Now, we're talking about two constitutions. We're always actually, when we're talking about stops statewide, we're always talking about two constitutions. We're talking about the U.S. Constitution, the federal Constitution, if you will, and in the case of New York, the New York State Constitution. If you're viewing this from, let's say, Texas, where I went to law school, you have the state of Texas Constitution. And these constitutions are different. These constitutions contain different things. The floor basically is the federal Constitution. Some states have higher constitutional protections than the federal Constitution. For instance, I think the state of Texas, if I recall correctly, states you don't get any greater rights than you do under the federal Constitution. In the state of New York, you have broader rights than the federal Constitution. So it all varies in what state you're in. But the Fourth Amendment, the U.S. Constitution, is the right of the people to be secure in their houses, persons, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and effects against shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by an oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be searched. And the reason why that in the U.S. Constitution, the Fourth Amendment, why that comes about, well, the much of our Constitution was based upon the experience of this nation's founders with England. The U.S. Constitution prohibits what they call general warrants, which is you can go ahead and search. A magistrate, oftentimes a magistrate under the king in England would issue a warrant, what we would call a general warrant, saying you can go search. These warrants weren't particularized. They didn't say where you could search, what you're searching for. And so the U.S. Constitution, when they formulated the Fourth Amendment, that's why they included these provisions that it had to be particularized, describe the place to be searched, and the person or things to be seized. Okay, and to avoid that, and that differentiates the United States from its English forefathers in terms of our Constitution. That's why that comes about. We're also going to touch on the Fifth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment is very broad. It has a whole bunch of things, and as you go through it all as a lawyer, and you really start to appreciate it as you get older and experience. But the Fifth Amendment speaks of many things. In other words, it speaks of you can't get charged with a felony other than by a grand jury indictment. I mean, ultimately, that's what it can be tried on. Sorry, not charged. Tried. You must be tried on a felony indictment. It prohibits double jeopardy. In other words, if you've already been tried and you were acquitted, you can't be retried on the same charges. That's what they call double jeopardy. It has a due process clause that you can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. In other words, things aren't just arbitrary. There has to be a process that the government goes through before it does that. The government can't take your property without giving you just compensation. That's the eminent domain clause. But for our purposes tonight, what we're going to talk about in terms of the Fifth Amendment, when we touch on it, that deals with you cannot be compelled to give testimony against yourself or statements against yourself. And that's the right against self-incrimination. That's also something that's very different than in England. In England and many European nations that follow English law or English type law, you can be, if the officers will tell the person who's a suspect that if you have a defense, you have to say it now because it'll hurt your case in court. We're the exact opposite in this country. In this country, we're saying you don't have to say anything at all, and the government or the state has to prove the case against you. So you get a real appreciation of the U.S. Constitution when you start measuring it against other constitutions. And just as an aside, real quick, oftentimes when people go abroad, they seem to forget that the U.S. Constitution doesn't follow them. And if you go to certain nations, you don't have any of these rights. You may not have any right at all. And so when you take that trip, whether you're going to Asia or Africa or Europe, just keep that in mind. This Constitution doesn't follow you. It's stuck at the border, so to speak. Okay, so New York, since we're talking about New York in particular, New York has a Bill of Rights just like the U.S. Constitution. And with regard to stops, it prohibits and guarantees you security against unreasonable searches, seizures, and interceptions. It also, just like the U.S. Constitution, prohibits you from being compelled to, in a criminal case, to be a witness against yourself. And of course, in the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, and also the New York State Constitution, gives you a right to counsel. In other words, you have a right to an attorney when you're charged in a criminal offense, particularly with a felony criminal offense. Um, and so you have a right to an attorney to go through the process with you. So that's basically the constitutional aspects of what we're talking about. So now we're going to talk about what the New York State law has called the 4 levels of intrusion. And this also really applies to all the states as well. These are basically factors that, to give you a Cliff Notes version of this, and I'll get into the details in a moment, but these talk about the factors that elevate an encounter and elevate the officer's right to be more intrusive during these encounters. And in New York State, it's been called or referenced as 4 levels of intrusion. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. Now, as I stated, these impact or escalate the police response, and they provide the officer with a greater basis to intrude. And what courts look at is the information the officer had initially when the approach occurred, and the information he gathers with the citizen as the encounter unfolds. And that's what we're talking about, the escalation. Certain acts, and we'll get to those in a moment, certain acts that a citizen does elevates the officer's response. And of course, look at that. The greater and specific details that the officer can articulate as to why the officer had to intrude on the citizen's liberty. Whether there was an unreasonable breach of the citizen's legitimate expectation of privacy. So, of course, look at the nature and the scope and the severity of the interference of your liberty, the individual's liberty, the public interest that served, and any objective facts which the law enforcement officer relied. And what I mean by objective facts, I don't mean subjective facts. In other words, what would a reasonable officer who didn't have any bias see or perceive? That's what they mean by objective, as opposed to subjective. Okay. This reasonable standard contemplates and is flexible, provided only that the officer's actions remain reasonably related in scope and intensity to the information the officer initially had and to the information he gathered during the encounter. The greater the specific and articulable indications of criminal activity, the greater the officer may intrude upon a citizen's liberty. So the bottom line is that the courts look at the reasonableness of the police officer's conduct when an officer stops a citizen, when an officer draws a weapon from his holster, when an officer frisks a person. And by frisk, I mean you've probably seen it on TV when they start patting somebody down on the street. They may pat their waist, they move their hands around their waistband, or they move down to their legs, and that's like a frisk. And so that's what I mean by frisk. When they detain someone who they suspect for investigatory purposes to evaluate whether a crime has occurred. And so those are some of these factors that courts look at in terms of the officer's actions. So let's talk about now the first level, which this permits a law enforcement officer to approach a citizen, you, and request information, provided, of course, that there's an objective. Remember, we talked about an objective reason, not just a subjective reason, an objective, credible, and articulable reason to do so. And it doesn't necessarily have to be based on criminal activity, but it has to have something. It can't be, I'm Officer Smith, and I just feel like stopping everybody who's walking down the street. That is not a credible, objective reason to do it. So there has to be something more than that. Now, what this means, as I stated, there has to be something that's objective and credible. It has to be sufficiently particular to justify the request for basic information. And by basic information, an officer can ask you your name, that sort of thing, your name, your address, that kind of thing. That's what we call basic information. This does not include, as I stated, approaching someone or a group of people, let's say, that you're arriving from or you're heading into an area of town that there's a lot of drugs. Many of these street encounters could be people who live in neighborhoods where there's a lot of drug activity, and that's often used as sometimes wrongly as a justification. So the mere fact that you're either walking into an area, or you're walking from an area, or you're driving into an area, or you're driving from an area in which there was drug activity, that does not permit the officer to just stop you just because you're coming from or going to an area where there's a lot of criminal activity.
Okay.
This does not this does not include situations where, let's say, for instance, we're talking about cars now. Let's say you're parked illegally. The officer didn't stop you, but you're parked illegally at a bus stop, for instance. An officer has every right to approach you. And when I say you, I'm talking about the driver now. And we're going to talk about if there's a passenger in the car in a minute. But let's say you're parked illegally on the street, whether it's at a bus stop or some other stop, and the officer approaches the driver for a traffic-related reason. So again, it has to be for a traffic-related reason. It can't be because you're parked illegally in an area where they sell a lot of drugs. Can't be just that. It has to be a traffic-related reason. If you've parked, as I said, in an area that's a violation. So the officer is allowed to approach the driver, ask the driver for his driver's license or her driver's license, and they're allowed to do that before they tell the person you have to drive off, you're parked illegally, whether they're going to write you a ticket or not, and just tell you to move on. But they have the right to ask you for your driver's license and identification. Now, the key here, though, it has to be related to for traffic-related reasons. If it involves a so-called traffic violation or a parking violation, it has to be for that sort of reason, the approach in a level 1 encounter. Now, I said we're going to talk about the passenger. Now, if you are the passenger in a car in which, let's say, the driver, I like using the bus stop example, parked illegally at a bus stop, and they're stopped there, and when I say stop there, they're already parked there, and the officer happens to come by, whether the officer's walking a beat and sees that, or an officer patrol car drives by and sees that, and an officer gets out. So if the officer, they can, as I stated, they can approach the driver, they can ask the driver for identification before they tell the driver, you need to move on. Now, if you are a passenger in the vehicle, the officer is not supposed to ask you for any of your identification because you are not the driver of the vehicle. You're not the operator of the vehicle that's parked illegally. You have the right at that point to get out of the car if you wanted. Let's say you just didn't like police. You didn't want to be around. You have the right at that point. You can get out the car and you could walk away. Or you can get out of the car and you can run away. Now, I'm going to tell you some practical tips too. Running is never a good idea because it's never a good idea. Because let's say the scenario I just laid out for you, the operator or the driver of the vehicle has parked illegally. The officer has approached the vehicle. For whatever reason, now it could be because a person doesn't like police, a person may be traumatized, they may be scared, or a person might have illegal drugs or a gun on them, or something that's contraband. All those reasons apply, and these things happen. And let's say that the officer is talking to the driver, and the passenger gets out the vehicle. And let's say the passenger gets out the vehicle very, very quickly. The officer is going to be scared. That's going to frighten the officer. And let's say that the person just takes off running. Officers are not going to just say, "Oh, well, I just stopped this driver here because excuse me, not I stopped. I approached this driver here because he or she was parked illegally, and I'll just let this person run." They're not going to do it. That's just being practical. They're just not going to say, "I'll just let them run." The officers will stop the person running. And let's say the person has nothing on them, then maybe nothing will happen. And hopefully none of the escalating factors we're going to talk about lead to these tragic things we've seen today, that goes on today. Um, so the best thing is to remain calm. But if that does happen, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, if that does happen and the passenger gets out and runs, let's say the passenger has drugs on them or has a warrant, or has an open warrant for them, and that happens. Actually, that happens a lot, and they run. Well, if they have a warrant and no other contraband, they're not charged with anything else, they're still going to be arrested on that open warrant. They're not gonna, their arrest won't be avoided because the officer technically didn't have a reason to stop them. They will still be they'll be brought in on that open warrant anyway. But let's say they have contraband on them. That raises what we call a suppression issue. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but uh, basically, though, first level intrusion in the situation of a motor vehicle, officer has a right to approach the operator of the vehicle. Officer has a right to ask the operator for their license, and then at that point the officer just sends the person on their way. If you're a vehicle occupant, you have a legal right to get out of the vehicle and walk away. You could run away, as I stated, but if you run away, practically speaking, you're going to have an unpleasant encounter with the police. That's just how it's going to be. Because truthfully, if you think about it, they don't know. They don't know why you're running, and they're not going to risk that you may have an open warrant, you may have a gun. Um, I can say this from my time when I was in ADA. This is back in the '90s when Giuliani was the mayor, and they had what they call the Street Crimes Unit. For those of you in New York, as I understand it, that unit has been disbanded. But that unit would basically just search. They have these terrible encounters, and I've had the experience of when they've encountered someone, what they call toss them or and searched the person, found the gun. In the case I'm talking about, and I've had the experience of calling the police officer and telling him, "Listen, I'm dismissing your case because the stop and the seizure violated the Fourth Amendment. It violated a person's constitutional rights." And I had an experience where an officer just told me, well, he didn't care. He said they were just told to get guns off the street. That's what they were doing. So uh, this is real life we're talking, and I'm just not giving you the theoretical, but I'm also speaking about real life here, and that's that was done, and that street crimes unit approach in New York anyway led to more of the approaches that occurred under mayors other than Mayor Giuliani. Okay, so now let's say though that you are a passenger, and if there are additional facts um, that are specifically tied to you as a passenger in a motor vehicle that could cause the officer to feel uh, that there's a basis to question you. If you were, let's say the officer sees you as a passenger, as the officer's approaching, they see you try to toss something or you make a gesture with your hand under the car seat as a passenger. Well, at that point, no one's going anywhere. And everyone's going to be ordered out of the vehicle. Everyone will probably be placed in handcuffs, being practical here. And the officer is going to look inside that vehicle, you know. Um, and that might still be suppressed. That might still be suppressed. But I'm just telling you, practically speaking, that's what's going to happen. At a minimum, the person's actions by, let's say, moving their hand under the vehicle as if they're tossing something in there. That could cause the officer to now question the passenger. You as a passenger, ask you for your identification. At the minimum, they can do that now. Now they have an articulable reason outside of the fact that the operator was parked illegally. All right.
Right.
So that's just an example of an escalation, the one we're talking about. An escalation in the form of what occurs with the passenger that leads to the officer taking another action.
Right. Gotcha.
Okay. Now, the second level that we're talking about is in New York State is a common law right of inquiry, which means an officer can momentarily stop you. Now, this is where the officer has stopped you, not where, like in the car example I was talking about, where you're already stopped, or if you're on the street, you were standing waiting for a light to turn green before you walked across the street, and the officer walked up to you. The second level is where the officer actually does stop you. In other words, they momentarily stop your movement. Okay. Now that can only occur when there is a founded suspicion that I don't know if you heard this term before. Criminal activity is afoot. They can only stop you for a short period of time to gain an explanatory information, but that does not allow the officer to just walk up and use force. They can't walk up and just grab you under the second level of intrusion. Okay, so that's the second level. The third level is where, and this third and fourth level, by the way, this kind of they're very similar. And in fact, to most people walking down the street, they're the same thing. And in fact, to the person who's being stopped, it's probably the same thing. But there is a legal difference in the two. So under the third level, an officer may forcibly stop you. In other words, they can actually put their hands on you and say, they put their hand on your chest and say, hey, wait a minute. They can, if you try to say, no, I don't want to talk to you, they can actually physically forcibly stop you from moving to answer their questions. This can only occur, though, where the officer has a reasonable suspicion that you, the individual, that you have been involved in criminal activity. Well, what is reasonable suspicion? Well, that happens when there's evidence or information that appears from reliable sources that discloses facts or circumstances, which all those things collectively are of such weight and are very persuasive that would convince an ordinary person who's intelligent, who has some sort of judgment and experience, that is reasonably likely that a crime had occurred and that you had committed the crime, or is being committed. So before the stop occurs, the officer has to be able to give specific and articulable facts showing why he or she made that stop. It can't be mere vague guesses. It can't be any sort of unparticularized hunch that you committed a crime. So let's say, for instance, there was a robbery a half hour ago, and they said there's a guy, the robber was wearing a puffy jacket. And a half hour ago, and miles away, could be a mile away, and you're walking down the street and you're wearing a puffy jacket. Well, that's not enough for the officer to that in of itself is not enough. Now, the things that can escalate it, like I said, the officer, you may be stopped, you're wearing the puffy jacket and you're stopped at a stoplight and you're waiting for the, if you're walking, I should say, and you're waiting for the light to turn green to walk across the street. Remember, levels 1 and levels 2, the officer can walk up to you and approach you and ask you questions on what escalates it. Now, let's say you're wearing that puffy jacket and the officer walks up to you and you bolt. Well, he's going to chase you now because it's not just a hunch on the officer's part, because the officer's thinking There was a robbery. This person, the robber, was wearing a puffy. I remember back in the '90s. I don't think these people wear them anymore, but they had those puffy jackets. Like balloons, basically. But that's the example I'm using now from my dated memory. But so the officer approaches you on a level one sort of situation, and now your reaction is escalated. You know, you look like you have fear in your face, and then you just start running. Now, it could be you're completely innocent. You might have been someone who's been traumatized by prior police contact.
Right.
But remember, the objective, reasonable, experienced officer who is not biased doesn't know that. You know, they don't know that. And if um, they're responding to a robbery, a robbery had occurred, and you somehow partially fit that description. That's not to say that. Let's say you were the robber. Now, that's not to say that it may not be suppressed. It may be suppressed. It may not be suppressed. But you're gonna get into a police encounter in those sort of situations. Okay. Now,
Mike, could you just explain? Mike, sorry.
yeah.
Could you explain what suppression is again?
Okay, suppression means,
Suppress. What does that mean again?
okay, suppress means this. Okay, so let's say you're arrested, and this kind of gets into the third part, but let's say you are arrested now.
Okay.
And
All right.
let's say you're arrested because they find contraband. Now sometimes things happen, and let's say they're looking for a robbery suspect, but they arrested you, and maybe you're not the robber, but maybe you have maybe you have cocaine in your pocket or something like that, or maybe you have some other sort of contraband in your possession. And so suppression is when you get together with your lawyer and you tell your lawyer certain things about how things occurred, and your lawyer then files a motion in the court saying, "Your Honor, I want to keep the states or the people in New York. They call it the people versus blah blah blah. Other states call it the state versus the defendant." But your lawyer says, "I'm filing a motion to suppress the cocaine found on my client's person." And a motion is some paperwork documents in which they say my client was unlawfully stopped in violation of the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution, and there was no probable cause, there was no reasonable suspicion for the officer to stop my client and search him or her and seize these items. And I want you to keep these items out of evidence in the trial. What the practical effect that has is,
Okay.
let's say that the court, after hearing, grants the motion, and the state, the people of the state of New York, or the state of Florida, the state of North Carolina, or wherever, the state attorney cannot bring that evidence into court, cannot mention that evidence in court. Well, what does that do to the case? You have a case in which you charge somebody with, let's say, cocaine possession, but you can't bring in the cocaine. That case doesn't go to trial. That case gets dismissed. So,
Gotcha.
so that's a very important concept. And so when I talk about suppression, that's what I mean. That's a very important thing that lawyers have to know, and getting good counsel. And we have problems in the criminal justice system, and it goes both ways. I mean, you have overworked prosecutors, you have overworked defense lawyers as well, and you sometimes you get a real good one, and they go to bat for you, and you have to just use your common sense. If you can afford an attorney, you're required to pay for an attorney. If you can't, then under the Constitution, an attorney has to be appointed to you. Now, just to be clear, it's not an attorney of your choice that's appointed. In other words, you can't say, well, I want Mark Garagos or some famous defense attorney. I'm poor, but I want the state to pay for him to represent me. No, that doesn't happen that way. You don't get your choice of attorneys. And in fact, sometimes you can have an attorney that you do not trust. Oftentimes, with defense attorneys, this lack of trust occurs because the defense attorney sometimes they don't return phone calls. And the reason why they don't return phone calls is because they have a ton of other clients too. And obviously, the individual who's charged, you care about your own case, but sometimes you have to realize that attorneys may have high caseloads with other people who care about their cases as well, and they may have older cases that go first, and it doesn't mean necessarily that an attorney is going to be a bad attorney because they don't call you back right away. Sometimes that is the case, though, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have an attorney who's actually finding very hard for a client who's in front of you. Your case might be relatively new. That person's case might be relatively old. Get ready to go to trial, and that attorney is concentrating on that particular case. So you have to use your discernment. Um, Sometimes reputation will be made in the community about who's a good lawyer and who's a poor lawyer. But that happens. And in terms of prosecutors, sometimes prosecutors miss things too. Sometimes prosecutors they don't look at their case uh, as clearly as they should. Some prosecutors may not really look at the stops themselves, and until they really have looked at the nature of the stop. And when you have a situation where you have a prosecutor who doesn't look at the case hard, and you have a defense attorney who doesn't think or look at the case hard, that's a terrible combination because you might be wind up at the eve of trial with the lawyer trying to move to suppress evidence or during the course of the jury trial. And the judge may say, no, you can't move to suppress. You had your chance to do it. So um, these are things about the criminal justice system, and that's everywhere in every system. The federal system is generally better because it's more well funded, but state systems are some states funded very well. Very few states actually funded very well. But in many states, you have dedicated lawyers. I know many dedicated public defenders and legal aid attorneys as well. So you have them. Anyway, I don't want to go off track. Sorry about that. So in this level of intrusion we're talking about, the right of inquiry allows more intensive questioning from the police. It also allows for a short seizure. In other words, the officer can tell you during that intense questioning, you can't leave. I have to question you. Now, in many circumstances, to the person being questioned, to the general public looking at what's going on, this is in fact the same thing as a fourth, the highest level intrusion. It may look like the same thing. It looks like a seizure. Now, as an interesting tidbit, that differentiates between federal and New York State, for instance. On the federal law, a seizure is when there's physical restraint. In other words, you can't move, you can't go. Under New York State law, as I was preparing for this, I was going back and reviewing some stuff. New York State law is broader. Remember we talked before about constitutions being the difference between state and federal constitutions sometimes, and sometimes state constitutions have broader rights. They're interpreted more broadly than the federal constitution. Well, New York is one of those constitutions in this particular way, and it employs what they call a reasonable person test, which is whether a reasonable person would have believed under that circumstances that the officer's conduct was a significant limitation on his or her freedom. So it may not necessarily be that physical restraint. It might be if the person reasonably believed that they couldn't leave in New York State. All right, now courts look at multiple factors in deciding whether under this third level of intrusion, whether it's proper. Was the citizen prevented from moving? And the answer is yes, what we're talking about here. Whether the officer, let's say the officer was in a vehicle and they turn on their lights and they use their bullhorn to stop you from walking. Um, the number of officers involved, if there's one officer or if you're walking in a van full of 4 or 5 officers approach you. And that's a difference than the officer who's just walking up to you and talking to you, one officer. The verbal commands the officer gave. The officer told you to get on the ground, stop moving, stop it, you know, hands behind your back. The type of verbal instructions that the officer gave as well. If you're in a car and the officer in a patrol car blocked you from leaving, in other words, you were trying to pull off and they pulled in front of you and blocked you from leaving, and they turned on their turrets and their lights. And of course, if they subject you to physical contact, those are factors that courts look at. The fourth and final level of intrusion is just the full-blown arrest, in which the officer walks up to you and literally, stops you from moving, slaps handcuffs on you, tells you you're under arrest, and they put you in the police car and they take you down to the police station or the police precinct. And that only comes about, again, though, when they believe that there's probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that you as the individual were the person who committed the crime. Okay. All right. This takes us to part 2 now. And this is the more practical part. And you'll see how it relates to part 1 about escalation that we're talking about. This talks about what to do when you're actually involved in a police citizen encounter. So let's say now we're talking about the street level encounter. For one thing, always be respectful. Sometimes it may be hard. You might feel very prideful. You might be annoyed by the police. You may have had negative experiences with police. As an aside, I used to tell officers that the police officer was the most powerful person on the planet. And I used to say that because I wanted officers that I worked with to know that what they didn't just impact them and the individual person that they encountered, but the entire community and the police. And I used to give the example of if a citizen is you live in an urban area and number of apartment buildings, and you're summertime, it's hot, and you're on the stoop and you're talking to your friends, and across the street you see an officer arrest someone, and in a very physical manner, officers use swear words against the person they're arrested. Now you don't know the context of it, you don't know what happened, but you're watching this and you're seeing this. And the officer treated the person very roughly, more roughly than was necessary to accomplish the task of actually effectuating the arrest. And now you get a jury summons. You got to go to court. And now you're sitting on the jury, and many people want to get out of jury duty, but you're not lucky enough. You're stuck, and you're now a juror in a criminal case. And in the criminal case, which does not involve the officer that you saw on the street, it involves a totally different officer. But the defense attorney is making the argument that the officer mistreated his client. You're thinking about when you were on that step,
right,
watching this happen. Now, you always take an oath as a juror to be fair and impartial. And a good prosecutor is going to remind you as a juror about that oath, but people are human beings, and I used to tell officers this because I wanted to impress upon them that how they behaved impacted other cases, and the officer who may have done everything right in a case may have treated the person completely proper no excessive physical force, nothing. That person who may have been like Joe the Axe murderer gets off because some jurors are thinking, yeah, I buy that argument. You know, it's happened. It has happened. And so that's why I would always begin and tell these officers their how they behave impacted the community, that far-reaching impact. So let me get back to it. All right. So when I say be respectful, and I know at times it can be tough. Um, I can say from experience this because I myself had a negative encounter with the police when I was a youth. When I think I was a junior in high school. I think Pastor Milton. Thankfully, he was in. I think he was in the army. I think he may have been in Texas. I'm not sure. I hope you don't mind me telling people that you served, but
No, no shame.
so my friends and I, we used to we trespassed. We would go to Brooklyn College and play basketball. We were high school students and not college students, and therefore we were not supposed to be playing basketball there and handball. Many kids in the neighborhood did that same thing, and I always remember this because it was a Friday night, and it was me, my late younger brother, God rest his soul, Mark, and and excuse me.
I think Philip was there too.
Yes, a friend of ours, Philip, and another friend named Marcus. Anyway, we were playing basketball there, unauthorized. And there was another group of kids there too who were oh, I didn't know, we didn't know who they were, but they played on the other end of the court. And those guys, they kind of messed up the place. Anyway, they left before we did. We actually straightened up the bleachers and everything. And I'll never forget it, an old man came. He was a security guard, and he told us to leave. And we're gonna leave. And then his boss over the radio said, "Nah, I want him arrested." And all of us, we're four young, strong men. We could have overpowered this old man easily. And the look, I've never forgotten the look in this old man's face. He looked so fearful. He was terrified. But we were good kids, aside from the fact that we're trespassing. And we wouldn't have, none of us would have harmed him. So we went to the office with him. And I was the tallest of the bunch, and there were two officers. And I remember being told the officers went in the security office there. There was an inner office in that office, and those officers went in there, and they told me to come in there. I was the tallest guy, the biggest guy of the group, and so I walked in, and there were two officers. One was taller, and one was shorter. And the taller one, he was farthest away from me, and I remember he was near a table. And the taller one told me to close the door. So I did. I didn't know. I was kind of confused. I didn't know what was going on. So I closed the door, and I felt this, I guess, touch on my neck, on my neck. And when I turned around, the short officer, he was swinging. He was throwing a punch at me, and I caught his hand. I was shocked, but I guess just the initial reaction. I I caught his hand, his right hand, because it was the right hand he threw, and then I grabbed him and I thrust him against the wall. And I remember just screaming at him, "Why'd you do that? Why'd you hit me?" And things were just going downhill very bad. I could hear my younger brother outside, my late brother Mark, screaming and cursing at the officers. And the taller officer had drawn he had unholstered his firearm, and he was lifting his firearm out of his holster, and he was telling me, "Let my partner go, let my partner go." And I remember I had this officer locked against the wall. He couldn't do anything. And I have to tell you, I'll be very frank with all of you. To this day, I hate those two. I still do, and I think I'll always hate them. And I had I held that officer to the wall, and I kept saying, "Why'd you hit me? Why'd you hit me? Why'd you hit me?" And when these encounters occur, street encounters occur like this, I can see firsthand, because I have this firsthand experience as to how time is warped. It may seem like an eternity. It could be 4 seconds, but it seems like an eternity. You don't comply with what the officer is saying because you're fearful for your life. We've seen this. You've seen this in recent cases. And you'll see the times the officer's telling someone, "Well, just relax, just relax." Well, sometimes they're choking the person. They ask them to relax. The normal human reaction is to fine. Anyway, that whole thing ended. At some point, I let the other officer go, and the short officer was saying, "I want him arrested." He was cursing. I want him arrested now. And to this day, the only reason why I didn't go spend the weekend in a lockup in Brooklyn waiting for an arraignment was because these two officers had dates that night. The taller one said to the shorter one, "If we do that, we'll be doing paperwork all night," and they had dates. So if this occurred on a Thursday night, I would have, I would have gotten, I've been arraigned by Friday. But if those officers didn't have dates that Friday night, I would have been, locked up probably till Monday over the weekend.
I just want to say, Mike, I think one of the things that is insightful for us right now, I just want to bring a point out that was very helpful. You mentioned how sometimes in certain situations, it could start with a simple stop, it can escalate, and you mentioned that the 4 levels and so forth. There is a principle taken from Proverbs, and in one insight, it says the following. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, and knowledge is to have knowledge is to have understanding or information about something. But wisdom is the ability to apply the knowledge that you have to daily life. And I think what's important in terms of what you've been laying out for us is that once we understand what our rights are, and as challenging as it is to respond in a very intimidating scenario, I think what might be helpful with what we kind of chatted with before, if you could just, you talked about always being respectful, and I like the way you tied it in with just your own experience. But if you can give the folks some of the other takeaways in terms of always be respectful. There's some other things you shared with me early that I think would really help folks.
Right. I'm going to get to that right now. Okay. So this is all part of part two. Okay. So be respectful. Try as best as you can to be calm as well.
Right.
And I said, I know it's not easy. One thing to do in an encounter with the police is if they ask you your name, never give a false name. And because when they ask you for your identification, if your name and identification don't match, you're going to get arrested at that point because they don't know who you are. You might have open warrants, and it would be prudent for them to find that sort of thing out. Okay. Second, keep your hands outside of your pockets until you're asked to produce identification. Now, if the officer starts searching you for let's say you have a bag, clearly state, I am not consenting to a search. All right, and you let them state that up front. Okay, and also you have to remember to tell your attorney you told them that as well. Okay. If the officer starts to ask you questions, don't waive your rights, to an attorney. Third, try to note your surroundings. let's say you're in an encounter with the police, and it's one of these level 4 encounters, and you're going to be arrested. Know your surroundings. Um, are there people that you know in the neighborhood who are around when this is happening? You may want to call them as witnesses. Are you near a store that may have a video camera out, or people in the store are looking out and there's a store employee? That's these are things you need to tell your lawyer, so your lawyer can go back and try to find some witnesses that may support your claims. All right. Um, the fourth thing, try to memorize the officer's shield number and name. If you can't memorize the shield number, that's really understandable, but at least try to memorize the name of the police officer. All right. And this is important. I've been in car situations where I was once stopped by an officer who was very rude, actually rude to my family as well. And this applies to what Milton was talking about in using judgment as part of just knowing the law. I could have gotten very upset with the person, and things could have escalated and got uh, you know got out of control. But the officer saw me looking at his name and badge number, and he just said, "Have a good day," and walked away. I didn't get a ticket or anything like that. I called this it was a state police officer, and I contacted the state police as well, and I later wrote them a letter. But in the state that I live in now, unlike New York, you don't have a civilian complaint review board, which is something else that may be something for a different discussion. But those of you in New York, you have the means in which, if that situation occurred in New York, I would have filed a complaint with that civilian complaint review board against that officer in my situation I was talking about. But as I said, try to memorize the officer's name and badge number if you can, but at least at a minimum the name. All right, so now let's talk situation where you're driving now. You're not on the street, you're driving. And let's say now the blue lights or the red lights come about, and now you're stopped. In other words, this is not the same situation we talked about where you are already parked. We're talking about now where the officer actively stops you from moving. The blue lights go on, or the red lights, depending on your state, and you're pulled over. Okay, try to pull over in a uh, hopefully you're in a populated area where there are a number of people. All right. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. When the officer asks for your license and registration, tell them where it's located and that you're reaching for it. Sometimes people put in their glove box, or it's in the visor. They just tell them, listen, my registration is in my visor, I'm getting it, or my registration is in my glove compartment, I'm getting that. And then slowly um, uh, produce that for him. As with the same thing with street encounters, when you talk to the officer, look at that name and badge number as well. Fourth, if the officer starts asking you questions now, like where are you going, where are you coming from, um, politely ask the officer, am I under arrest? Am I free to leave? Because this triggers what we're talking about before, your right to remain silent. Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. So if it's just a car stop, let's say it's for a traffic infraction, then you get a ticket and you just be on your way. Now, fifth, if the officer, however, tells you to step out the car, remember, do not argue with the officer. Don't say, why'd you stop me? I mean, you can ask him politely, why am I being stopped? But if the officer now tells you to get out the car, don't say, why do you want me to get out the car? Why do I have to get out the car? Don't argue with the officer. Um, and when you get out of the car, get out slowly. Don't get out fast as if the officer thinks you're going to get into a physical encounter with him or her. Then note these sort of things in case that you are actually arrested and you see this. If the officer is leaning into your car and he's using a flashlight, let's say it's evening hours, or even if it's daytime, the officer's using a flashlight and they're looking around in your car for something. note that's what the officer is doing, and you make sure you tell your lawyer that's what happened. Because in the event that, let's say, the officer sees something, in other words, took something from the car, some sort of what they believe to be contraband, and you're charged with it, that's something again for your lawyer to know, and for your lawyer to investigate and possibly file a motion to suppress what we were talking about before, that kind of evidence. Now, if the officer asks you, let's say the officer asks you, where are you coming from, where are you going? And let's say you don't do what I I referenced, which is basically, am I under arrest? Or let's say you start engaging in a conversation with the officer, and the officer, and you say, "Well, I have nothing in the car, officer." And the officer says, "Well, all right, do you mind if I look?" And you say, "Well, okay." Now, let's say you don't mind it because you really don't have anything in the car. You could, what you're doing is you're giving him consent, or her consent, to search your car. And they also or can ask you, "Hey, sir, can you step outside?" And you say, "Fine." And you get out, and the officer looks around, searches your car, and if they find nothing, they send you on your way, and you call it a day. If you can do it if you want. Now, if you don't want people searching your car, whether or not you have anything in there at all, then once again you have to state, "I am not giving consent to search my car." All right. So that is of course up to you.
Okay.
But when always be polite, always say politely, always be polite with the officer. And as I said, if you don't mind them searching the car because you think, well, listen, I've done nothing wrong, and it's fine for me for the officer to search my car, then that's on you. That's up to you. You can freely allow the officer to do that if you want. But if you're some other people, I myself, I would not allow that. And I don't do anything wrong. I don't have any contraband in my car. I just don't want people searching my car. Um, and so then you have to make sure you say you're not giving permission for them to search your car. Now, if an officer has a search warrant, again, tying it back into what we talked about before, well, if they have a search warrant, that means they've shown probable cause to a judge. And of course, your lawyer, by the way, can test this in a motion to suppress either way. But initially, if the judge issues a warrant, that means they have probable cause to believe that there's some sort of evidence of criminality in the car, and that could be drugs, guns, some sort of odd evidence, and that evidence is inside the car. And so the officer they won't need your consent. They can just search the car. It's a search warrant. They'll just search the car. Now, if you are, and again, by the way, if they have a search warrant, again, the overriding principle that you've heard me say all night is do not argue with the police. Don't argue. Don't let things escalate with the officer. It could be the officer could be rude as hell. They could be a very rude person, and not every officer is going to be officer friendly and be very professional. And I think if these officers were that way, we wouldn't have the, well, I shouldn't say, if some officers, if all officers were that way, then we wouldn't have most of the problems that we have now. But you know, you just have a mixture of personalities. Sometimes you could probably be a very nice and professional officer, but the person they encounter has so many negative experiences with other officers that it will escalate even with that officer who isn't that way.
Right.
You know, we're all a sum of our experiences built into how we react to things. That's being a human being. All right. So again, though, no arguing. If you are charged with a crime and if there's evidence that he sees, your lawyer can fight it out for you in court. That's the whole thing. If you're stopped for drunk driving, particularly in New York State, this is probably the same in all states as well. You may be required to take a breathalyzer test, and if you refuse, then you will be arrested. Your car will be impounded, and your driver's license will be suspended. Probably that's the same in just about every state. So let me give you just my opinion, my 2 cents about car stops in particular, because I think this is pretty relevant to things that happen today, and I've seen it with young people, particularly young people, And this may not occur to any of you who are watching this. So I'm making some assumptions. Many of you are probably very mature individuals. Many of you are church going, so I don't anticipate you to have some of these problems. But you may have uh, uh, grandsons, granddaughters, girls too, sons and daughters that this may impact, and this is something you may want to share with them. This is just really just my opinion. Well, especially when you're talking about Black or Latino young men, if you if there are a bunch of you in a car, there's probably a good chance there's going to be a stop. And sometimes the stop can be objectively. The officer may have a negative subjective intent to do it because he may see a car with uh, Black or Latino kids, and he's probably think he may or she may think, well, they may have some drugs or gun or whatever in there. Um, and the person who is driving the car might be driving in excess of the speed limit. And the truth of the matter is, how many of us do that all the time? I mean, that's easy thing to do. Sometimes you might be going 35 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, something like that. If there's an objective reason, in other words, what the courts would look at is if an officer who is not this officer who's biased, who has a subjective um, intent to stop Black or Latino kids, if an officer, the objective officer, in other words, the officer who has no prejudice at all, who just sees someone driving, using the car example we're talking about, 35 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone, turns on the lights, it's the same thing. The courts look at it that way. It's a stop based on a reason. There's a reason that a law was violated, and that the operator of that vehicle violated that provision of the traffic law. You see, so whether you're the subjective officer who just wants to make a stop, really doesn't care about, in fact, the traffic violation, and then you have the objective officer who is stopping the vehicle because of the traffic violation. There's a justifiable basis for the stop. There was a violation of the law. The operator of the vehicle violated the law. You see, and
Right.
so the vehicle can be stopped at that point. And now, what happens between the objective officer and subjective one impacts what happens next. Oftentimes, I'll get to that in a moment. So, as I was saying before, young people in cars. Um, let's say that there is, in fact, a stop. It's important for you to know, and for your children or grandchildren to know, who are the people that they hang around with. If your son or your grandson is the one who's driving the car, he or she is at the most risk in many ways, because let's say there's someone armed in the car, and let's say your son or grandson operating the car drove too fast, and which is very easy to do, as we're talking about, and the vehicle is being pulled over. You don't know if the vehicle is being pulled over by an objective officer who's just trying to, give a citation for speeding, or a subjective officer with subjective intent to make an arrest because he sees a whole bunch of kids in the car and it's probably got some sort of drugs, maybe some marijuana or cocaine or something like that in the car. Either way, the vehicle is stopped now. Now, even if it's not your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter who has any sort of contraband in the car and was just operating the vehicle, someone who's in the car may drop drugs in the car because they don't want it on their person, on their body. Or someone may, if they have this really, they're all bad situations, but a really terrible situation where someone in the car is armed illegally with a firearm, and they take that firearm out, and they just, let's say they're the front seat passenger, they toss it under the seat, and it goes to where your son is now the either the driver of the vehicle, or most likely, let's say your son is the rear backseat passenger, and they see the front passenger just toss a gun right between their legs. Now they have a choice to make, to say, when the officer sees their gun, if they try to hide that gun, now they're making things worse. That are they going to rat out this person in front of them? Is the person in front of them even their friend? Do they even know that person? You see, so
Right.
it's
Right.
it's critical. It's critical that young people understand this sort of thing. These sort of things happen, and when the officer who approaches the vehicle, and oftentimes if there's two officers in the vehicle, in a marked unit like in New York, you'll have officers approaching from both sides of the vehicle. In many states, just one officer in the vehicle, and they come by the driver's side. And if that officer spots gun, everybody's getting arrested. Everybody, for the officer's safety. You have to think of it. If you're the officer now, you find a gun in the car. You don't know whose gun it is. You don't know if there are other guns in the car. Are the other people armed? You see, everyone is getting handcuffed that night and arrested. Every single person in the car. You know,
Right.
and then you may get a situation where people start pointing at each other. Or someone tries to, or if your son or grandson, or granddaughter, or daughter, is the persuadable type, someone may say, "Hey, listen, man, I got two felonies. You just take this from me. You're just gonna get probation. Nothing's gonna happen to you." Or if your son or grandson or granddaughter is a minor who's a passenger, not the operator, is a minor in the car, and they say, you take the gun because you're a minor, you can't get charged, and they're easily influenced. Now they end up taking a charge for somebody else. You see, so I'm terrified. I've got my son is he's a college student now, and I've been lucky, that he's a gamer, and he likes to play his games, so he doesn't really hang out with a lot of folks. But I would be very frightened if my son was actively going out, meeting with groups of people, and in cars with groups of people, or anything like that. That is a frightening thing in today's world, in my view. This is just my opinion. All right, so. Um, so the things you don't do. Well, before I do that, I do have one pet peeve I want you to all know about things. You've seen it on TV. You've heard this expression. Someone has been taken down for questioning. There really is no such thing. If in cases where the person has been charged, the defense has always been that they've consented to the questioning. Like they've consented to go down. They have consented. The police show up at your house and they say, you, or let's say your son or your daughter, well, something happened. There was a robbery, and I'd like to ask your son some questions, or I want to ask your daughter some questions, and we'll bring them back. We'll take them down to the police station, and we'll bring them back. Well, for one thing, if your son is a minor, you have a right to be there. And if or your children, or person's a minor, if they are minors, quite frankly, you shouldn't you shouldn't consent to them being interviewed at all. To be frank with you, wait till you have an attorney who could understand what the charges are. If the officers are speaking to you, want to speak to your son, they generally feel that your son's probably a suspect. They might be looking, they may have an open mind, but at the minimum, they're thinking your son's a suspect, possibly a witness, but probably a suspect, to be frank with you. And if they're a minor, you have a right to be there. And I'll just say what I would do if it was my son's situation and my son was a minor. We're not talking to the police at all. No, not until I'm an attorney. But even I wouldn't. I'd have another attorney represent my son, so I can just be objective. Have an objective voice do that. But bottom line is no speaking at all. Okay, let me speed through the rest of this, Milton. I see my time. I should be more cognizant of the time. Okay, so the things that you don't do, and I kind of touched on this. Never argue with the police. I said it again. So I'm not going to say it much more than that. Never run from the police. Never fight with the police, because all you do if you physically fight, and when I say fight, I mean get into a physical altercation with the police. You could be charged with an assault on a law enforcement officer or some sort of assault or resisting arrest. The bottom line is in all of these encounters is everybody wants to get home in one piece and safely, and keep that in the in the back of your head during these encounters as best as you can. All right. And how you react, as we said, hopefully this has gotten through to everyone today. Raise the level of escalation. Now, the third and final part. This is going to be a very fast part. This is the process. Let's say everything happens and you are arrested. You don't fight or anything like that, but you are arrested. Again, stay calm. Do not resist. Ask for a lawyer. All right. Don't make any oral, written, or videotape statements. Say, I want to speak to a lawyer. And after you're taken to a police station, you'll probably be searched again. You may be searched at the scene. You'll probably be searched again at the police station. You'll be photographed. You'll be fingerprinted. In some states, your clothing may be taken from you. You may get one of those. You've seen people in those prison jumpsuits, orange suits or yellow suits or something like that. Your clothing may be seized. You'll get a what they call a voucher, a property description of your property. Ask to call. You get the phone call. Ask to call. Tell a family member that you've been arrested. Okay. In New York, for instance, you'll then be taken to central booking. In other states, you might just be taken to the courthouse for the arraignment. In New York, central booking is often at the courthouse. You'll be taken to central booking. They'll check your fingerprints, your criminal history, whether you have any warrants on you. Now, in New York, they made some changes to the bail laws. I'm sure everyone who's from New York probably has heard about this. In 2019, the law was passed. It went into effect in 2020, January 2020. There were some problems with it, notable problems, and they changed it again in April of this year, and it's gone. Some of these changes went into effect again on July 1st. In New York State, for most misdemeanors, and in most states, quite frankly, in most states, with misdemeanors, and a misdemeanor is a crime that's punishable by up to a year in jail. So from 0 to 12 months, that's what a misdemeanor is when I say that. In New York State, misdemeanors and non-violent felonies, judges are required. Now, when I was prosecuting there, that was not the case. Judges set bail then, but now judges are required to release people with the least restrictive conditions that will assure that they return to court. For violent felonies, judges have the discretion to either release you on your ROR on your own cognizance, or without pretrial conditions that are designed to show you return to court. These conditions can be electronic monitoring, participating in drug treatment, set bail. In certain felony cases, murder, for instance, you get remanded. There is no bail if you're charged in a murder case. In New York, some states actually allow bail, but many states do not. Let me talk about some final tips. Again, if you or your loved one is arrested, say nothing. Don't waive your rights to incriminate yourself or your right to have counsel. If you can afford an attorney, one is you retain an attorney if you can't. One will be appointed to you in New York. It's the Legal Aid Society for Indigent Defendants. In other states, sometimes they have public defenders, and other states just have appointed counsel. So your state might be different. In New York, if you believe that your rights were violated by the police, we talked about the Civilian Complaint Review Board, you can file a complaint with that review board in New York. Your individual states may or may not have that. Most states don't have that. Where I live, they don't have that here. Some states do. If they do, then you can do that. Again, if you're, I touched on it, if you have a minor, they also have legal rights. Again, you have a right to be with them when they're being questioned. Uh, so I hope this was helpful, and that concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. I'm so grateful for you spending the time with us. We just need to take some time to kind of process this information and then to pass this on. I want to just encourage you. Thank you so much for tuning in, everybody. I want to just encourage you to pass this particular broadcast along. This is not the type of information that we're given that is like a quick read of a brief essay or something. This is something that's substantive because it relates to what's going on in life. So we can, I just wanted to avail you of this opportunity to be able to have Michael come on the program to just kind of enlighten us and even share some of his own personal experiences as an attorney. And yet he himself has experienced many of these things. So Michael was not speaking from a theoretical base perspective. He lived this, he experienced this. And so I want to thank you so much tonight for coming in and joining with us. Please share this again. If you have any questions, you want to just drop it in the chat after the broadcast is over. I can certainly make arrangements and ask for my brother to come back or just to get some more further information. Just remember that the information that we've gotten tonight, we have to just think about the tips. What do I do when I encounter a situation? To learn what our rights are. And the key is, as hard as it is, it's all in the approach. It's all in the reaction. But once if we follow suit in terms of what we know our rights are, then we let the process work in terms of asking the right questions. Am I under arrest? Am I free to go, as Michael was sharing before? So again, thank you so much, Mike, for coming and sharing with us. I want to thank you all so much for, I'm going to hold you to that. You know that. I want to thank you so much. Thank you so much for my regular folks that have joined in tonight. The Lord bless you. Have a great evening. And the time was well spent, but you need to kind of go back and find those pointers that that Michael shared. Remember those things. Share it. I'm just pouring my heart out to you. This is information that can literally save our lives and the lives of those that are close to it. So please share this broadcast as much as you can. I really appreciate it. Well, God bless you again and have a wonderful night. God bless you and talk to you all soon to the next broadcast. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Mike.
Bye, Milton.
Love you.